Welcome to the Nick Bryant podcast. Today, my guest is Dr. Juliette Engel, and she wrote a book called Sparky, Surviving Sex Magic. And it's about her childhood. And she was raised in horrific circumstances, and she was also subjected to government-sponsored mind control. How are you doing today, Juliette?
I'm doing fine, thanks.
Thanks for coming on the Nick Bryant podcast. I have read a lot in this area, and I've had some mind control survivors on my podcast before. So I'm pretty well versed in this area. And I've done 2 podcasts on the extreme abuse survey. But your story is still extremely chilling. Regardless of how many times I read stories like this or talk to people that have been through what you've been through, it's still very chilling to me. And
yes,
your father started molesting you when you were relatively young.
well, actually, it was my grandfather,
Mm-hmm.
and my father sold me and watched while I was being molested. Whether he did himself or not, I don't think so. I think he terrified me, but I can't remember if he actually did.
And your grandfather, he was, I think, part of a secret society.
Yeah, he and all of his brothers were Shriners, and his father was the commander of the Knights Templar of North America. And the family didn't even know that until he died, and all the regional commanders came into Chicago with white horses, and they had a parade down, I don't know what the main street of Chicago is, but with the white horses behind his catafalque. And so they found out then that he'd been the commander of the Knights Templar.
In a prior podcast of mine, I was talking about ritual abuse, and we started to talk about the jesters, which are a segment of the Shriners. And
Yes.
they've been busted repeatedly, doing very bad things to children. And they seem to not have any consequences. And
No, I'm sorry.
you talk about when your father had you take a bath, that it was kind of ominous because you knew that you had to clean yourself up so he could pander you. So baths became kind of a negative thing for you.
Yeah, I still don't take baths.
Showers?
Yeah, showers, of course.
I'm not much of a bath guy either.
Yeah, I mean, you can jump out of a shower, you're stuck in a bathtub. No baths.
I haven't taken a bath probably in years, and I still keep. There's still hygienic upkeep with showers. I mean,
Yeah,
at
showers are
least I
fine.
think so. I mean, people that interact with me might beg to differ. And you met a number of Dr. Greens, and people that have been through mind control. A lot of them say that they met a Dr. Green. You met various Dr. Greens. Could you tell us about your first experience with your first meeting with Dr. Green?
Well, I was very young when this started, and the first really clear memory I have of going to a facility and being left there was in Seattle. And I've identified it later, having come back 50 years after that and lived near there, as the psychology department of the University of Washington. And at that time, they had that was like a post-war annex type setup there. And in there, it was called the annex. And in there was Dr. White, and over him was Dr. Green. Then there was always a Dr. brown, and nanny blacks. And the nanny blacks were like these, you didn't know if they were men or women dressed in habits and little white aprons and strange hats, and they took care of the kids.
And they were the ones that would do sadistic things to the kids also.
Well, everybody did sadistic things to the kids.
Yeah.
They were the ones that kept us drugged, which we considered a good thing because, it kept us out of pain.
Your parents were extremely evil and just looked upon you as a commodity.
Mm-hmm.
And
I was a source of income and annoyance because they had to feed me and buy me clothes, and I kept getting picked out in school. The social workers would always, at that time, the schools were really for the kids, and they'd always pick up that I was coming back from a week or two away from school, covered with bruises and black eyes, and then they would go visit my parents, and my parents would know they were coming because the California state laws, they had to be informed, and they would pick up and move. So I was from school to school to school, and my parents just always blamed me for that. It was a major inconvenience.
And occasionally you'd be put on a wheel and there'd be men in robes around you. And there was a chant, there is no joy, there is no sorrow, there is no truth. There are
no light, no dark, no right, no wrong, no man, no woman. And
it sounds like that was just really infused into your brain, that particular chant. It comes up periodically in your book.
Yeah. And I think it's significant because that's the basis of mind control, because they push it, so you can't really hold on to anything. And their goal is for you to let go of your reality, of your definition of anything, of knowing what's right, what's wrong, what's good, what's bad, what's day, what's night, what's evil, and the goal is for you to let everything go and to give up your soul. And at that point, you see a flash of green. So that's the Dr. Green. He's the eater of souls. That's the green agenda. That's every human being without a soul. The Green New Deal, all of that is all about human beings who have surrendered their souls. CERN, this is the Great Hadron Collider. They're manufacturing God particles, which is a soul. They're trying to create souls. So are they creating souls to put inside of soulless creatures that they've created? I don't know.
I can remember watching on video the unveiling of the CERN particle accelerator. And there was a very strange ritual involved with it all. And I thought, wow, that's kind of weird.
Yeah, and it's right on the temple of Abaddon or Apollo, which is Satan.
Your mother was complaining to Dr. Green that you had a very vivid imagination. And he said, well, that's conducive into splitting her identities. And you talked about a number of your identities: Arabella, Rose Red, Wendy, Chun-Lin, and Highland Beauty.
Yes, I spent a year as a horse. And I didn't talk for a year, I think, or at least a long time.
And you would eventually have to integrate these various personalities, or would you just work out a system to function with these?
I forgot them. Just walled them off, buried them, forgot them. So you could come up the next year and talk to me about something that had happened the year before, or someone. I would have no memory, no recollection. I can still do that. I have to work hard not to do that. But yeah. That's how I dealt with it. And because we moved from school to school to school, social worker to social worker, place to place, I just walled them off, left them behind, did a lot of work on remembering to get some of them into Sparky. I think I picked the least traumatic ones, the ones I liked the best. And of all my personalities, Sparky was the one I liked the best, little Sparky McGregor, who went out and fought battles and rode horses and led a Highland clan. Sort of like what I'm doing now, actually. But yeah, I became Sparky. So I created a character, became that character, and then stopped erasing the past. Well, pretty much.
You talk about vacuum cleaners, having like
Yeah, suck out the memories.
Just sucking. And at a certain point, Seattle became problematic for your parents, and your Dr. Green had said, "We don't have the Seattle police on board. We have a few jets. It's not enough." So you were then relocated to Southern California,
which is where my mother grew up. She was born in Beverly Hills, and she wanted to go back to California.
And your maternal grandmother had been an opera singer.
Yeah.
And at one point, you talk about a discussion between your mother and Dr. Green, or one of the many doctors who are named Dr. Green. And your mother is saying, we need more money for this kid. And Dr. Green said, this is the NSA, not Fort Knox.
Yeah. That's the first time I heard the term.
NSA?
Yeah, but then I heard it a lot more because my uncle was one of the founders of the NSA, my mother's brother. So
when we think about mind control, we think of the CIA, not the NSA.
Well, as my mother explained it to me, even as a child, the CIA was not allowed to do anything inside the United States, but the NSA was created so that they could do the same thing, except inside the country. So when my uncle was traveling abroad, he was CIA. And when he was in the United States, he was NSA. And he was actually the one that went to Britain and set up GCHQ and Five Eyes and all that. So, but when he was in the United States, he was NSA.
And at a certain point, Dr. Green gets very upset at your mom because your mother and father are pimping you out as a little girl, and he thinks that's counterproductive for your program.
Right. Distracting me.
And he said, you have to take the child to the annex in San Luis Obispo. We've started the Monarch program there for Southern California. So what year was that with the Monarch program?
Let's see. My first trip to the annex in Seattle would have been like 1955, 1956, right in there. And then 57, 58 in Southern California. In that part of Southern California, around Los Angeles, Laguna Beach. Then I was in San Diego in multiple different schools.
And you called these places the annex.
Because the first one was called the annex. So I called them annexes.
And you eventually ended up in Southern California. And I thought this was very interesting. The next annex I frequented was on Lookout Mountain, where there was a movie studio and lots of little girls with haunting eyes. And that's right off of Laurel Canyon. And there was that, it has been reported that there was a movie studio on Lookout Mountain and Laurel Canyon. And you talk about a lot of your abuse and child abuse material went down at Lookout Mountain.
Well, it was they were making pornographic movies.
And actually, there were movie stars at making this child abuse material
Yes.
at Lookout Mountain. You talk about that.
Yes. And they were also there. People who are now movie stars were there as children the same time I was. I'm not going to say who they are, but yeah, they were there. So they grew up in the Monarch program. And then from there on, I don't know. But they've stayed, a number of them have stayed in Hollywood and been quite successful.
And
music industry too.
And in 1959, you stayed with your grandparents for a couple of months. And you came across a book called The Miracle Sword of the Clan McGregor.
Yeah, just a piece. It was a piece of a book.
And that ultimately changed your life.
Mm-hmm.
There was an altar that emerged called Sparky.
Sparky McGregor.
Who you've talked about a little bit. Tell us a little bit about Sparky and when did you meet Sparky?
I was just learning how to read and trying to read, wanting to read. And right after I'd found this book and taken it out of my grandmother's things and taken it with me when my parents took us back. And then my mother took my brother and I on a cross-country train trip. And I was going to a new place. We were going to Seattle. Never been to Seattle, didn't know what was coming up. Was trying to read the book Sparky, but having a hard time because it was kind of oldish style with a lot of Gaelic type expressions in it, and script writing. It was quite old. I don't know how old, but it was an old book. And I was trying to read it, and then I started seeing this little Scottish girl, and it's like she came right out of the book. She was wearing the kilt and the hat and the shiny shoes, and I was like this drab, tired, beat up, miserable little kid, and I would get out of my mother's cabin and just go somewhere on the train with the book and sit there and try and read, and she would appear. And she started chiding me for, feeling sorry for myself. And, don't I realize I'm a Scottish warrior and this is my ancestry? And, clearly it's me talking to me, because it was the first information I'd ever had about my family. The way my parents and grandparents acted, there was no doubt that the McGregors, that's a big part of who we were. And so I suddenly had these warriors in my past, and they did great things with swords and battles and brave deeds. And I decided, okay, this is what I want to be. This is what I'm going to be. And then I made friends with Sparky. And Sparky started teaching me how to be a warrior and how to speak Gaelic and how to read the book and how to do all these things, these incredible things. And by the time I started school, which was a few weeks later in San Diego, after we arrived in San Diego and moved into this horrible apartment complex on the Mexican border, we were the closest residents to the Mexican border that was still in California in the United States. But I was Sparky by then, so I could handle it. And I started organizing the neighborhood kids who weren't any better off than me. And we started having our rusty old bicycles became our horses, and we had adventures out. The apartment was actually on the Tijuana sewer, which is exactly what it sounds like. It was open settling ponds of shit as far as the eye could see, with these dirt dikes running across them, 2 feet wide. And you could ride your bike across there, but boy, if you fell in, I think you would die. And And we would ride our bikes across the dikes and up and down and all around and have great Highland adventures down there. So I basically lived the best year of my life down in the Tijuana sewer, which it's still there. It's called the marshlands, but it's I mean there's not much you can do with it. It's a marsh and it is still a sewer. And so that's where Sparky got started. But by the time I went to school, I was so embedded in that personality that I used that name and insisted on using that name. It came up with a whole system for how all the kids, not just me, but all the kids could draw pictures in the dirt and create tunnels that would take us all the way to Scotland. And all we had to do was, just by luck, to create a picture that matched the other side of the world. The tunnel would open, we'd go through, and we'd be in Scotland with real horses and real kilts and real swords. I had quite a few kids convinced.
Yeah, they seem to follow Sparky. And the mind control was going on during this period too. And you talk about going into a classroom where there's other children, and you say that they looked like musketeers from the Mickey Mouse Club.
Oh, they could have been. They could have been. This was the whole Disneyland connection.
And they took you to Disneyland and asked you to compromise.
Disneyland was very much part of it. And it started out, they started training us. Actually, my very first day there was dressed me up in a cute little dress. Oh, it was ridiculous. They didn't give us any food. So we'd been there all night and the morning without any food. We were all really hungry, except we were all drugged too. They'd given us these jelly beans that made us stupid. And we were told, we were dropped off at different points in the park. And we were told if we wanted to eat, we had to go find a daddy and get the daddy to buy us some food, and then get the daddy to take us on the Wild Toad ride, the Wind in the Willows Wild Toad ride at Disneyland, because there were cameras in there's a part in that ride where you come around a track and it looks like a train's coming right at you because it's a very bright light and it comes straight at you in this little car that you're riding in. And there were cameras. So at that moment, you had to get the daddy's hand someplace it shouldn't be so that they could get pictures. And I did that. And if you didn't do it, if you weren't successful, you couldn't get back on the bus. So half the bus was empty, and we never knew what happened to those other kids.
And then you met someone named Chip.
Chip, yeah.
And he was the one who was using the term sex magic.
Well, yeah.
And you had some kind of psi abilities, and he also had psi abilities, and he was there to help you cultivate your psi abilities.
Yeah, he was teaching me how to enter a third space between two people and actually physically feel like you're in that space communicating, and then you both remember what happened in that space. So that's what the psi was about.
And you talk about, oh, go ahead, sorry.
I made my mother so angry because she'd been picked for having psi, but then it apparently failed. She wasn't good enough at it. So she hated that I did well at it. And it was like, this isn't a gift. This isn't something I want to do. This is some horrible torture that I'm being forced to do. But she thought I was having such a wonderful, was so special. I don't know. She'd obviously been in a program of some sort also, and very badly damaged.
And they started to take you to the Stanford Research Institute.
Yeah.
And that is ostensibly the beginning of remote viewing.
Yes, and that's what they had me doing.
At SRA. And you were cultivating skills to be a remote viewer, to find places in Russia.
Yes, that is a story that I don't tell people because it's like, who's going to believe that? Well, I think you will. they had me viewing. They put me on the wheel and they do all this disorientation and drugging and all the nonsense. But then I would come off the wheel and I would be in Russia, and I'd be in a specific place, and I'd have to find another specific place. I was looking for a way into the Central Communications building of Russia, and to go in there and to plant some explosion. Actually, it was to plant bugs and lions and things like that into the impenetrable Central Communications, where all international communications for Russia and the Soviet Union went through one place. And it's true, it did. And so I over and over and over and over learning the streets and learning the places and learning the looking for the way in, which I finally found. I found the way in. I knew the way in. And I don't know who told me, but that several people had actually tried to penetrate and been killed. So there'd been a very unsuccessful program. And
had physically tried to penetrate?
Yeah. Of course. It was the 1960s. They wanted people, Americans, to tap into the central lines. So they were training me to go be an agent. Clearly disposable, because you'd never survive this. Get in there and do that. And the very odd thing later, so 30 years later, when I actually went to Russia, I had total knowledge of this part of the city, but old knowledge, like things that used to be there and weren't there anymore. Like it had been before the Hotel Rossiya had been built. That's when I was on the streets in my remote viewing programming. But I could go around the areas. I knew the names of the streets, and actually wound up with an office inside the building that had the secret passage to the telecommunications center, the Rostelecom building of Russia, and got down there. Of course, it was gone. It's not there anymore. They've gone to computers and satellites and all that. But Rostelecom let me go down there and look around. It's like, what do you want to see? You know, it was just some candy wrappers on the floor and a few old broken machine parts way down below the street. But I did get down there. And everybody's like, why do you want to come here? There's nothing here.
What your journey?
And I didn't know.
Did take you to Russia, which is kind of fascinating. I want to jump on that a little bit later. But your parents were abusing you quite frequently. And when you were in San Diego, a number of teachers, I believe a social worker, principal, said that, looked at your history and said that your family was obviously involved in abuse, and they were able to glean social services reports from other states where you'd been in. And your parents fled to Canada, took you and your brother and fled to Canada.
Yeah, they had to leave the country or my father was going to be arrested.
And then things apparently the NSA or whatever dark malignant corner of intelligence is doing that to you, ultimately cleared your record, because then you went back to California.
Yeah. And my father he was indebted. He was terrified of these people. He died at 95 a few years ago, and he was still terrified of these people, of
Of
whoever it
the
was.
of the NSA people or whatever.
He was terrified of anything I might say, or yeah, he thought he'd be arrested, killed. He didn't know. But as soon as I started to really remember, my parents again left the country. So this is when I was 30 and my daughter was born and I was starting to have memories. They left the country and I never saw them again. Not really.
And when you returned to California, you'd gotten older, and your training as someone to compromise other men or older men, that continued.
Well, yeah, right. At that time that's when Vita Polakis was running the girls in Laurel Canyon. You know that song, young girls are coming to the canyon. I can see them walking. Well, that was us. Came to the canyon for the parties. They gave us costumes to wear, lots of wild dancing, lots of drugs. And I was studying math between the parties, trying not to take the drugs. But I did what I had to do, and yeah, I recognize people who were in that, and people who wanted to be in it, and people who were forced into it. There was both, but it was all about photographing and compromising high-level people.
You talk about pill popping politicians and record executives.
Yeah.
And you are the party favorites. You and the other young girls are the party favorites for them.
Yeah, the young girls coming to the canyon.
I've been doing a lot of research on P. Diddy recently.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that he had a very similar setup.
I mean, as a child, he was programmed?
He was pandering children to various people and to himself. And he also had, his homes were wired for audiovisual blackmail. And we've also seen that with Epstein, and we saw that with the Franklin scandal, and that goes on and on and on. Blackmail. But despite all these things that you went through, I mean, horrific things, there was a part of you that managed to get good grades in school, that did well on tests.
Had to. Would not have survived.
And what do you mean that you wouldn't have survived?
Well, I had no future. And I knew what was waiting for me if I didn't get away and didn't get out. And since I had no family backing, in fact, my family would probably kill me. I mean, literally. My way out was, and I think Mrs. Lipsky in the 5th grade when I was Sparky said, you just got to be stronger. You've got to be smarter. You've got to grow up. You've got to get the grades, get out. So from then on, that's all I thought about, basically, was getting out. But like you said, you run away. If you run away, then you're in even more trouble because you have no one helping you. And everybody preys on the runaways. It's just an awful situation for them. So,
as we were talking about earlier, I ran away the first time when I was 12.
Oh, yeah.
So, I'm really glad that I did not get that far that time, because if you're 12 years old on the streets, bad things can definitely happen to you.
And no one's going to help you.
And you had this magical odyssey where you were able to escape that and go to the University of Washington. Tell us about that. That's kind of a fascinating part of your book.
Well, I had it didn't just happen. I was in high school in Palo Alto, and teachers in the high school, that was still when the teachers really cared about the kids. I don't know if they do anymore, but the teachers kept picking up that there was abuse at home and that things were wrong. And then suddenly my parents announced that we were going to move I was working on getting a scholarship to Stanford and getting scholarships to college and getting out of my mess. And my parents said, no, we're moving to Seattle. So they were going to take me out of high school, move me to Seattle, where I was going to be put right back into the whole University of Washington mess that I'd come out of. But I did have that connection to the University of Washington because my father's boss was a big time alumnus. So I enlisted all kinds of people's help to get admitted early. I was too young to get a scholarship to the University of Washington, but I did get an early admission with the help of people like my father's boss, who I sort of semi-seduced. And so when I escaped from was Murphy Hot Springs, which is now Esalen in Monterey, and stole my Chip. Chip was passed out in his Triumph, his red Triumph car, and I stole him and the car and took off for Seattle.
And why do you think that they didn't come after you? You ended up at Seattle at the University of Washington. Why do you think that they didn't come after you? Because these government people had put a lot of resources into you, and
maybe they did. Maybe they did. I've done. It's possible that I was still under some kind of project. I don't know. I saw myself as completely independent, and then again, I'd forgotten everything, so I couldn't remember anything. So when I showed up at University of Washington, I was a new person, and I looked like the other co-eds, which I hadn't a week before, and I fit right in and got a job typing autopsies at the University of Washington, and really just focused on studying.
And your goal was to be a doctor, a medical doctor.
Yeah, I didn't know what I was going to do. I knew I was completely on my own. I couldn't count on anyone or any help from anywhere. And I was looking through the University of Washington catalog, which is about this thick. And I came to medicine, and there was this guy in a white coat with horn-rimmed glasses, and he's looking through a microscope. And I thought, science. Yeah, I can do that. It was that simple. So that might have been a mind control moment, because I decided right on the spot to go to medical school. And at that point, I had nothing. I had no expectations. No one was supporting me, but I mounted a huge campaign, building relationships and being Sparky McGregor and getting myself into medical school as one of, I think there were 5 women in this class, 120. And I wound up graduating first in my class. So
throughout your story, despite all the things that are happening to you, you excel in academics.
Yeah, and all the time I thought, and I still feel like I'm really inadequate in terms of intellect. So
your parents pounded you into nothingness. I mean, they really
worked
they
did.
Hard.
They did
to make sure that you had no self-worth whatsoever.
Right, and so did the rest of my family, who I didn't know. I didn't know anyone until we started connecting up using Ancestry. We started running into each other, finding each other, and we were all in our 50s and 60s then. And then the whole story becomes obvious when you see what's happened to other people in the family, what they did to all the oldest girls in every family, and who was connected to what. And then it was clear that my uncles, my grandfather and my uncles were all involved in Project Paperclip. They'd all been at Nuremberg, and they had all these keepsakes and elaborate gifts from Nazis. And the story was they were grateful for the for how nice they were at Nuremberg. No, they were grateful because they'd resettled them in the United States. And I mean, elaborate gifts. Like one uncle had a full SS uniform, dress uniform, gorgeous thing with all the epaulets and the medals and everything. Another one painted a beautiful portrait of my uncle and my aunt, and it must have taken a very long time. So it was obviously not done at Nuremberg. It was done in California. So so that's what they were doing, and that's why we were all kept apart. None of the cousins, probably a dozen cousins, we didn't know each other. And wasn't as soon as we knew each other, then the whole story starts coming out.
Hugo Boss was very good at designing Nazi uniforms, and now that company is very popular.
There's a lot of Nazi influence, and
designer clothes, yes.
Yeah, and MK Ultra's Mein Kampf Ultra,
and
it's Nazi ideology.
Definitely, some of these paperclip scientists were working in mind control.
Yeah, the Dr. Greens, I think, were the Germans.
Did they have German accents?
They had accents.
That accents?
I couldn't tell you what nationality they were. They were white and they had accents.
And
they were in charge. These people were in charge, the Greens.
We really cleaned a lot of these Nazi war criminals up and brought them here on paperclip. And a number of them were definitely war criminals.
And we're dealing with the second generation. And you know, the information, when I was in Moscow, I was a source for Christopher Story. I don't know if you know him. Maybe you do. He did the world reports. English, I can't blanking on the names of his. He did a weekly world report, and he was reporting all of these things that we're seeing now, and saying the crimes that were being committed and what was being done. And then he was murdered in 2010. And where was I going with? Oh, yeah, because he had said that all of the records from the paperclip, from who was brought into the United States, including Canaris, were kept at the Murtaugh building in Oklahoma City. And that's actually what was blown up when they blew up that whole section of the Murtaugh building, and could care less that it was on top of a daycare center. And that there actually is a Nazi museum a few blocks away from the Murtaugh building in Oklahoma City, with some of the records were there, but I don't think they're there anymore. So the second generation came along and cleaned up behind the first generation, but we've still got these people.
I had a friend in college who really excelled at robotics and also at the rudimentary stage of artificial intelligence. And he went to the University of Minnesota as a freshman, and they quickly bumped him up into graduate level classes. And he ultimately was employed by NASA. And he was talking to a friend of his who was also employed by NASA. And he said, I'm really getting tired of these second generation Nazis.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
And his friend said, well, it's either the money is going to go to us or it's going to go to welfare mothers. So there was definitely a social Darwinism that had been passed down, not only from the Nazis, but to the Americans that were working with the second generation Nazis.
And they generated all these soulless but highly intelligent second generation intelligence operatives like me, who had their souls stripped.
You did very well in medical school, and you graduated from medical school. You got married. You had a couple of children. And at this point, you did not remember what had gone on in your childhood at all, which is very common. People with DID really don't get diagnosed until their early 30s to mid 30s. They're not even aware that they're DID. And you ultimately settled into a fairly normal life after a while.
Yes, yeah, I did. And it was a very successful life. And that's why I sort of, well, I just don't know. We were successful. We had wealth, big house, all the perks. We were hanging out with it was the Seattle in crowd, you know.
And your
It was the
husband
beginning.
was a surgeon, a renowned surgeon.
Yes, an orthopedic surgeon, right? Right. So I mean, it was sort of the young and extremely successful set of the United States was right there, and I was right in it.
And then I think your life takes kind of a pivot here. You go to the Soviet Union, and there's a Soviet American Citizen Summit. And you see how incompetent obstetrics is in the Soviet Union. And you decide to start helping with that.
Well, there's a few steps in between there. So in 19, when my daughter was born, and I had this little copy of myself and no memory of who I was. That's really the crisis point. And because every time I would start to remember, I would get the horror of my own life. And I was terrified that this meant I was going to do something to hurt my child because I'd been so hurt. And it just started driving me nuts. And I kept remembering more and more and more. And I finally went to a friend who was a psychiatrist who'd known me for years and asked him if I was crazy. And if he'd said, yeah, you know, we're going to have to admit you or something, I would have killed myself that night. I was ready to do it. And he said, you're hyperachieving. You're like annoying, you know. It's just hitting me with all my faults, which I couldn't disagree with. And then he said, but you're not crazy. And then he said, well, so let's talk about your mother. And that started it because I had no recollection of my mother at all. I still don't. And or very little. And it went from there. And eventually it led to, well, a lot of things led to a divorce. My husband and I split up. And in the middle of a divorce, I was invited to go to a party celebrating some authors in Friday Harbor, which is up in the San Juan Islands outside Seattle. And so I went and stayed with my friend, who's a very famous author. And we went to this book party. And I thought it was going to be a big party, but it wasn't. It was just a few people. It was her, it was Ruth B.B. Hill, and another couple of authors who are police. And it was in this beautiful house, this all glass house overlooking the San Juan Islands. It was just the most beautiful house I'd ever seen. It was just gorgeous. And so we're sitting around, just a few people, you know, talking, and they're trying to give me drinks and stuff, but I don't drink. And people started flying in on seaplanes, a whole bunch of them. And it was all the Iran-Contra CIA types, you know, flying in with their planes and coming in their black leather gear. And, you know, they were a type you saw quite a bit, or I saw quite a bit of in Seattle. And they came in, and One of them was Jeffrey Epstein. So clearly, in 1988, these guys were tasked with building an offshore resort for was for famous people and for heads of state, and for it had to be very secret. And they were looking at buying an island in the Caribbean, and they were interested in. At that time, I was a radiologist, and I was doing development on ultrasound technology, and had my own tech company, and they wanted to know if I could hide just regular analog information inside digital data. And I said, yeah, that wouldn't be too hard. And so they wanted me to come with them, like right then, and start working on this project. And they were going to give me the house for a nominal amount of money. And but I was in the middle of divorce. My kids didn't fit into this equation, and so I turned it down, and it didn't feel right to me. But obviously they were getting set up to buy Little St. James Island and just move everything they'd been doing in Nebraska and everywhere else. They were doing it offshore, so that they wouldn't be harassed by people like Caratori.
Gary,
the guy that, yeah, Gary Caratori. I remember when his plane crashed, and he was on their tail. And there were many
of the Franklin. I think that the Franklin network was different than the Epstein network. I think that they kind of pandered to different types. The Franklin network was primarily pandered to Republicans, and the Epstein network, I think, primarily pandered to Democrats.
No, they pandered to everybody. It was anyone that they could snare in that CIA web. It came right out of the Iran-Contra, that group of guys. There were probably several projects, and Jeffrey Epstein was one of them. We just haven't uncovered the rest of them yet.
I keep seeing indications of many of them. And then you ended up in Russia.
Yeah. Another thing I thought was a coincidence turned out not to be. But just out of the blue, I was divorced. Things were settled out. My kids were dividing time between myself and my ex. And during one of those times they were with my ex, I accepted an invitation to go to Russia as part of a citizen summit. And then had the most bizarre experience of my life, practically, when they took us in a bus to Red Square, let us out on the square. And all I could say was, I've been here before, and I could speak a little Russian. I could read the street signs. I knew where things were or where they had been, and had a whole deja vu experience, which in retrospect was the remote viewing, memories of the remote viewing from the Stanford Research Institute. But later, I found out that the invitation had been arranged through someone who knew my uncle. He'd been at Bletchley Park with my uncle, and arranged for me to come to Moscow and wanted to meet me. And he didn't say any of that until the very end and right before he died, which was years later. During the Second World War, it's where they decoded the Enigma.
Oh, that's right. Yeah.
It's where Turing invented the computer. Apparently my uncle was there, and some of the Russians who then became the top of the GRU were there. So
and you saw that things in the Soviet Union were very barbaric. with regards to obstetrics, and you
Yeah.
decided to get involved.
Yes.
And
Yes.
then, go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, I just had an irresistible pull, familiarity to Russia, which I couldn't explain.
And then you started getting involved in prevention of child trafficking.
Yeah, I discovered wholesale trafficking from orphanages, and as the economy in the Soviet Union was falling apart, which it was while I was there, it was obvious that the predators move in on the most vulnerable, and they were taking children. And that also like stirred up all kinds of things in me that I couldn't explain. But I was determined to stop it, and did a lot to help at least slow it down in the former Soviet Union. And then came back here and found out it's worse here than it is there.
Well, you delivered your findings at the United Nations and then at the Vatican also.
I did it at, we did a nationwide or a multinational study, actually, because it was Russia and the former Soviet republics. We did a survey all over the country. It took a year, and got a huge amount of data, which is, I think it's in Sparky how we did that. And it showed that the three top countries for human trafficking from Russia and Ukraine in that area was Germany was tops, then United States and Israel. So by far the top three. And so since the United States was involved, and we were receiving State Department money to do the study, and the results obviously weren't what they wanted to hear. But we gathered information on who was trafficking, where they were going. They were going to New York and Virginia Beach primarily. So we found out what flights they were going on and who was receiving them, and tons of information. They could have just walked in there and rescued people and solved cases. And so I took it to the UN and made presentations. I took it to State Department, took it to the Trafficking in Persons Office, took it to Congress, presented the results to the Vatican. Nobody wanted to hear it. Nobody would listen. Nobody would even look at the information. So I still have it. And so we're.
And at this point, that was part of the Angel Coalition, I believe, right?
Yeah. We created a coalition of very small organizations in a country that barely had toilets and running water and electric lights. And with just our connections to each other, we were able to create a rescue repatriation network that went to the Russian Duma and got legislation passed, got tremendous support from the national media. It was Putin's party was coming to power at that time, Единство Россия. So they got involved. They got behind the counter-trafficking movement. And the American embassy fought me every step of the way. It was almost clown-like, because I would go to the Russian Duma, we take reports. I mean, it's just pure data. You know, everybody could take it, check it, confirm it, which they did. And the Americans would like come from the embassy, sit in the front row and diss me the whole time. Like, we'll get rid of her. No, she's not going to be funded. Nah, blah, blah, blah. And the more they do that, the better the Russians liked me. So, but it was a very strange situation to be in. And I think maybe my past history of being in strange situations made it possible to tolerate that.
How long were you in Russia?
I worked there for 20 years and I lived there for 10 years. So 20 years overall. Came back to the US in 2010. Tried to then take the information back to all those agencies and say, you know, we've got a problem. It's here. This is the information from Russia. I didn't have anything from South America or Mexico, but I had enough to show that this was happening in this country. No one's looked at it, and no one still has looked at it. And in fact, no one is collecting data on children being trafficked into the US or through the US. And when a county in Texas tried to collect data on trafficking victims in their county, they were told to destroy the data by the Department of Homeland Security. So there's any movement or any move towards stopping human trafficking in this country is going to have to come from the the Tijuana sewer up. You know, it's got to come from the people in small towns, and it doesn't matter if they're wealthy or just determination. So we're using the new social media platform Republic, which has just been launched, and it is based on starting at local organizations, so that local organizations can sign on, communicate through networks within their own local circle and then between circles. So there's like 3,000 zip codes or 3,000 local communities in the United States. We want to get them all hooked up and connected and working on the prevention of human trafficking. And this is the one social media platform that will do that. So I know you just joined Republic, and so it's going to work. We're going to be able to do this. We did it in Russia with no resources, and here we have the resources, but tremendous oppression from the top.
Well, I've been waging a battle for 22 years. And
yes, you've been at it. You've been in the trenches.
I see the needle moving, albeit
Do you?
slowly.
Oh, good.
So I'm not entirely despondent. You went to a conference in San Diego, and it seemed that you were deluged that setting close to where you had been living, that setting just really sparked a tremendous amount of memories, repressed memories.
Yeah, I went to a conference. It was a law cross-border trafficking law enforcement conference, and I really went because I wanted to be down there at the border and see if I could like knock these memories. The thing, memories, it's hard to believe your own memories when you're starting to remember things that are really awful. And of course, a lot of what happened to me, it was done under the influence of drugs. So there's crazy stuff mixed up in there that is a memory, but it's the memory of me on drugs. So, but if I can get a scent, a smell, the smells trigger memories for me more than anything. And San Diego stinks. I mean, it's a smelly town, and so I wanted to get those scents and see if it would stimulate the memories I had, particularly being down on the Tijuana sewer. That had its own symphony of odors. So I went down there. I smelled everything. It was more smelling than seeing, and it just started to. It did start to stimulate the memories, and the difference between memories and imagination and lies is that memories never change. It's always the same. Maybe a little variation, but the core of whatever it was, the feeling, the smell, the taste, it's always the same. It stays the same.
And with your journey since then, it sounds like more integration than working out a system where the alters can talk to each other.
I still have DID, there's no doubt. Sometimes it comes in really handy. Other times people will ask me something that happened yesterday, and I like have to do a workaround to get to yesterday. because it's in some other reality. I don't think other people have to do that. So, yeah, integration has been a large part, but there's a lot of parts I don't want to remember. So, why should I? If you had to ask me, I've got about 100 different identities in there. Most of them I never want to see again.
So
I'm trying to remember what's going to be useful in this fight, this battle. Where are the tools?
and have you gone the psychotherapeutic route at all, or
I did initially, and my psychiatrist had no idea what was going on. This was back in the 80s, so he had no idea he trusted me that I was telling him real things. But I hope he's read Sparky and he'll understand what I was talking about. But
you've had this life of incomprehensible child abuse, and then the government stepping in to actually abuse you much more and to create alters and develop your psi abilities and remote viewing. A lot of people would have a hard time with all of that. People are skeptical and they don't want to believe that their government, and I found this out from firsthand experience, they don't want to believe that their government could be involved in child abuse, or at least parts of their government. What would
they've
you say
admitted it. It's not a secret. It came out in the church hearings. They admitted to all of it.
The church hearings were kind of just swept under the rug. The CIA came out and said, well, we tried a bunch of stuff and it really didn't work. And that was that. That's kind of what the CIA said. And Sidney Gottlieb and John Gittinger testified, and they were able to skate on that. I do have an MK Ultra report on using electroshock drugs and hypnosis to induce psychic abilities. So that was definitely part of the program, was developing psychic abilities. And we had remote viewers for 20 years, even though we kept this remote viewing alive for 20 years, even though our government said it didn't work, which I'm highly skeptical of. But
it works.
How do you explain this to someone or what would you say to someone who is skeptical of what?
Well, I don't care. I don't care if they believe it or not. Whether they believe me or not, I could care less. I'm telling my story. I'm putting it out there. I'm not going to defend it. It's what it is. And I'm actually have less. I have met with less skepticism than I expected. I expected it to be just totally trashed, like I was as a child when I tried to escape and tell people that I was being. I mean, I did try to escape and begged people to help me, and was just like the kids in the Franklin scandal. They just turned me back over to my psychotic parents. So I learned to just shut up and grow up. I want to just grow up and then fight back when I had some cojones on my side.
And when did you retire from practicing medicine?
Well, when I went to Russia, so in 1990, I became less of a clinical specialist and more of a teacher, and then transitioned into running a nonprofit organization that did the counter trafficking in Russia, the Angel Coalition, and we also did orphanage training. We worked with World Childhood Foundation. It was a very big program and very successful. And I'm really proud of what we were able to do, and frustrated that we can't do the same here, like that the resistance here and the size of the problem in our own society is just shocking. And you'd think I'd know that since I grew up in it, but I blocked it entirely.
Well, I've been researching trafficking for 22 years. And what I've written about is the government covering up child trafficking, which is basically the government aiding and abetting child trafficking. It's going on now with P. Diddy. And that is not a message that Americans want to hear. It produces tremendous cognitive dissonance. And I feel like I've had a sledgehammer and I've been breaking away at a wall for a very long time. And I'm starting to make some dents here and there. But it has not been an easy slog.
No, tremendous cognitive dissonance and gaslighting and like just pressure, repression.
Very hard on the Franklin scandal. And I really do believe that I proved everything that I set out to prove.
Fantastic book.
And according to Wikipedia, it's just nonsense. So,
well, Wikipedia is nonsense.
I know, but try to tell.
You should be honored. I don't even get into Wikipedia. I was kicked out of Wikipedia in the 1990s, and they said, no. I had a choice. I could it was the Soros. I could go along with the Open Society Network, Open Society Foundation, or I could continue like I was doing, which was blowing the whistle on them. And that was it. I'll never get into Wikipedia.
I had Larry Sanger, one of the co-founders of Wikipedia, on my podcast.
Oh, yeah.
And he talked about there were a number of addresses from Langley, Virginia, IP addresses, and that did not surprise me at all.
Mm-hmm.
It's a superlative tool to keep government malfeasance covered up.
Sure. And they eliminate all other information and sort of force you to go to Wikipedia.
Unfortunately, when I've gone to LA and I've tried to sell projects, or I've tried to sell projects within showbiz, people in showbiz really don't read that much. And they go to the Wikipedia entry on the Franklin scandal and or the Franklin child abuse allegations. And then that's it. I mean, of course, like the walls go up and like I'm obviously, deranged or whatever conclusions that they come up with. It's
correct. I think you're correct. That can't be.
And I never really was gaslit until I started writing about child trafficking. Yeah. I had spent 5 years in academia writing about lower socioeconomic children and the problems that they experience in the United States. All those papers ended up in good journals, and I wrote a book about it, or I co-authored a book about it. And it was very well received. But then when I read about the Franklin scandal, I'm no longer a sensible person. I've had to deal with that. But I really thought your book was great, Juliette. It was really, really a good book. It's very well written too. And the stuff that you explicate and the way that you explicate it, it's a very touching, heartfelt book. And I would suggest that people get a copy of it and give it a read.
Well, I wanted to make it clear that it's a book of survival, because when I hit the place where I created my persona as Sparky, I knew I was going to survive. Up to that point, it was touch and go, and I was trying to be a horse and other things. But so I would, in Russia, when we had kids who were severely traumatized, and then they would go off into their alternate identities, and the psychologist would say, "Oh, we got to bring them back." No, leave them there. help them create an identity that works for them. You know, it's don't make them remember the past. A child forced to remember that kind of drama is going to lose their mind. Adults can't handle it. Children certainly can't handle it. And that's a tragedy about all these terrible things that they're being exposed to in school, which are right out of the monarch trainings, that there is no man, there is no woman, there is no good, there is no bad. There's, you know, it's just appalling. Like, where do they go for help?
Our society is obviously an empire in decline.
Yeah.
And we're acting like an empire in decline. I want to thank you so much for being on the Nick Bryant podcast. And I really enjoyed your book as much as I can enjoy a book like that. I found it very edifying.
Survival. We're survivors.
So thank you so much, Juliette, and have yourself a great night.
Thank you. You too, Nick.